Here's my general view of any identity or anything of that kind. Gender identity, social identity, whatever the case may be. Not really my problem. Come to think of it, in the clear light of day, rather than, rambling late at night, it makes a lot more sense. Who gives a flying fuck? Is that oversimplified? It probably is. But who really cares how people act, how people think? I do think when it comes down to, this is probably a thing that's going to upset someone. With forms, the term other, acceptable. I made a video yesterday, and I think someone probably watched that video and took offence, unless they saw something on my Facebook feed, or on a friend's Facebook feed, because I was talking to Aldous Valor as well. And, yeah, we kind of agreed variables, in some ways, and it's funny, you end up with people on someone else's, page, you end up with people saying there's only two genders, and they're kind of right, but there's also variables as well, and they admit there's variables, so they admit there's naturally occurring variables. But it seems to me that a lot of the debate over, gender identity is to do with using the term gender as a way of personal expression. That's the part of the SJW. It's personal expression. And they call it a gender identity. I think the term is inadequate, personally. It doesn't really... it doesn't have explanation power. I think any word which you're using should have explanation power. It should have some kind of way of actually explaining the facts. It should be, in effect, a working theory in that regard. But also, it's worth pointing out that many people who say, oh, no, there are only two genders and no variables, they actually agree that they're not that wacky. They agree there are variables, there are differences, there aren't set positions, there are different types of male, there are... And it's actually interesting, they kind of agree in pretty much every single way, just not necessarily in the way in which they would express what they perceive as being correct. And the only real difference between what the average person, I tend to have contact with on the internet, and the SJWs is, the only real difference is they go far further. Far, far further. And it's also a development of language now, which I suspect a great many people out there would have a problem with. So trying to change the language to make a thing a gender issue, even if it's not necessarily a gender issue per se. How might a transvestite who doesn't wish to say it's a gender issue? I've known, when I've gone to gay pride before, I've known various dames. They just dress up like pantomime dames. And that's not a gender thing really at all. By modern SJW standards, you could have a person who is a dame, and they would make that a gender too. It's not to say they're excluded from the LGBT plus other letters community by any extreme or any stretch of the imagination. But still, it's a point, isn't it? So I think there is a lot of confusion out there. I do agree, and I made this point on Facebook, that there is the chemical differences between people. You can have men with, more testosterone or whatever the case may be, naturally occurring. You end up with variables there, different types of males. You end up with women with different levels of estrogen, or even a largely a lack of these chemicals too. These things happen, and in many ways you could argue that there is gender identity or gender diversity, even if you say there's only two genders. If you go that far and say, okay, two genders, then you have to account for the chemical differences, as well as psychological differences. I mean, you can't blame it all on psychology. A lot of it is chemical and neurological. And once you get down to the neurological status of people, you can't necessarily simply say it's merely psychological. Otherwise, you're dismissing how people's brains have actually developed. Although psychological effects, because of the plasticity of the brain in early life, especially, can have an impact. But jumping to conclusions over that and saying it's just a mental illness is a mistake. I don't agree with that. There was some confusion there with someone called Leslie, perhaps over that issue, it seems. He got a little bit angry and I called him a cunt, but, in good humour. And we shared some links. Well, he shared some links with me. And I do agree with that. And I'm not entirely sure which quotes really pissed him off. Not entirely. So, really, it's an interesting subject. But I think a lot of the problems people have is where people are saying there's something when really they don't know, jumping to conclusions, especially young people who tend to get things wrong, or people who make their gender identity something ridiculous. Like there are a few radical cases of people wishing they were much younger, or wishing to live their life as a was it transageist or whatever it was. So that's one radical example. I agree that's a radical example, and it's not really worth mentioning in the mainstream, but it is a thing worth pointing out that the fringes of these ideas are quite radical. It's very much like the fringes of sexuality include things such as, I don't know, pedophiles and bestiality. We wouldn't consider them to be socially acceptable in any, way, shape or form. But, of course, it's worth pointing out that they do exist. So maybe there's a counter-argument there. But as I say, the main problems people tend to have are with the radical views, the radical cases, where you have some, as is suggested, some very bizarre, out there perspectives. So maybe that's the real crux of the matter. That's the real problem, as it were, that we have people who are, expressing ideas that aren't well supported, aren't well defined, and sometimes they are quite out there, and without full explanation, full clarification, there is greater confusion about the subject matter, and indeed there might be the misplacement or misallocation of the term gender identity, although there could easily be reasons for that, but that would require in-depth explanation to make clear why a thing is or is not the case.